I need to talk about Pride and Prejudice 2005, the costumes in it, and why those costumes are such an important visual vehicle for all of the internal stuff going on that we see in the film. And not just the costume design, I'm talking hair design, the lighting design, the set design, hell, even the camera positioning. It's all part of it. About how, by the end of it, Darcy is basically naked by Regency standards in the final proposal scene, and what this means for his emotional arc in the film, and how Lizzie steals and wears her favourite coat as a form of protection. Now, I've seen this movie close to 50 times, but this is the first time that I've ever watched it with my fashion goggles on. And for context, I am a fashion designer, a sewing pattern designer, and I used to work in the fashion industry as a product development assistant, a textile designer, a garment technician, and a women's wear fashion designer. Now, for last year's 250th anniversary of Jane Austen, I actually made a Regency dress for the first time. The one I'm wearing now is just my toile, my sample. I've got my final dress behind me. And I also made a pair of stays and a chemise. So while I'm not a fashion historian or a fashion anthropologist, I definitely know more about fashion than the average Joe. Now, I need to preface this video with a disclaimer. I am not here to start a war, like so many people think you are as soon as you talk about either one of the Pride and Prejudice, either the BBC series or the film. And I'm fully aware there will always be this kind of heated discourse between both of those adaptations. And I think it's got to do with the one that you kind of grew up watching, but also the one that connected with how you felt about the book. So I know there's a lot of passionate people on both sides of the camp. So I'm not here to start a war. This isn't about comparing who did it better, which one was better. It's about why the decisions in this movie serve the core message of Joe Wright's interpretation of Austen's work. When I began researching this, I've been doing it for about a week now, really deep diving, I found this one image on an article that I was reading about it, and it just said, historical accuracy is not costume design. Historical accuracy is not costume design. And I'm like, okay, this is a really good reminder for me going into this that that's not the standard we're all trying to reach here. Costume design is an art form. What we are doing is we are watching an artist's interpretation of another artist's work. So Joe Wright's interpretation of Jane Austen's work. And if we want the original, the book is right there. We need never actually watch a film or an adaptation. We can all just kind of imagine it in our minds. But for this analysis, I want to get deep into Joe Wright's framing. So I'm going to say, when it comes to the Pride and Prejudice 2005 film, there are a lot of historical inaccuracies, hiccups, and just flat out anachronisms. And I'm being fully honest with that. Despite this being my favorite film, I'm fully aware that there are a lot of inconsistencies here. However, I don't believe that they are mistakes. I believe Joe Wright and Jacqueline Duran, the costume designer, have deliberately sacrificed historical accuracy for emotional and psychological clarity. Jane Austen, when she had written and published Pride and Prejudice, she wrote a letter to her sister Cassandra. And in that letter, she said that Pride and Prejudice was too light and bright and sparkling. She added, it wants shade. It wants to be stretched out here and there with a long chapter of sense if it could be had. And Joe Wright said, from the Baltimore Sun article he did, responding to a lot of critics who were critiquing his adaptation, saying it was too romantic or too swoony, and then the fact that he had cut down Wickham's role. He said, I kept in my back pocket a quote from Austen that said she felt the book lacked shade. I felt I could supply darker shadows, and that if I did, I would have earned the right to lift off into romance. And the only way that I can really explain the difference between the BBC adaptation and the 2005 film, it's a quote that's kind of come up again and again when I've been researching it. And it's that the BBC adaptation was how Pride and Prejudice would have been, whereas the 2005 film is how Pride and Prejudice would have felt. And I think once we kind of recognize those distinctions, we can appreciate both of the adaptations for what they are, and almost them being kind of companion adaptation. So if you want reality of what it would have been like, you can go to the BBC adaptation. And if you want more of a romantic kind of feeling, a more visceral interpretation, you can go to the 2005 film. And this interpretation really boils down to the fact that The BBC adaptation is over 5 hours of footage, so you're really able to capture so many more storylines and details in terms of the dialogue in that, whereas the film is only 2 hours and 8 minutes. So I actually really appreciate that Joe Wright has focused more on what it might have felt like to get that impression in a shorter period of time. And the costumes are a visual shorthand for the missing dialogue that we essentially get in the BBC. They've used costume design as that visual shorthand to communicate things that they didn't have time to actually fit into. The film is essentially a Cinderella narrative, and every costume design, every lighting design, every set design, every music design and narrative choice kind of stems from that creative decision. So I think Wright is trading accuracy for cut through and impact. And another reason for the anachronisms in the film is the actual waistline of the garments that we see. Now, we know it as the Empire line, but that wasn't what it was called then. They were obviously super duper high, like what I'm wearing right now, if not a little bit higher. And Joe Wright found out that the first version of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice was originally called First Impressions, and that was published in 1797, whereas the final revised version that we know as Pride and Prejudice was actually published in 1813. So Jane Austen wrote it in 1797, and I think Joe Wright used that as an excuse to kind of lower the waistlines that he didn't like so much and just cater to his own aesthetics. But the funny thing is that despite Lizzie's waistline being lower, it actually plays into elements of the characters that we see as to where their waistlines are at. But I'll get into that deeper as we go on. So this kind of Cinderella central device is about making the Bennets seem lower class than they actually are, making them seem poorer and more destitute than the reality of what the book actually is. And by creating that contrast, you're seeing the opposite end of the scale where you're getting Caroline Bingley and she's in her fashion-forward silhouettes and colours and hairstyles. So we're actually getting a very clear visual cut through of, I guess, the distinction between the Bennets and the Bingleys and, Darcy. And sadly, everything else, the loss of satire, the class confusion, kind of stems from that Cinderella narrative choice. And another thing Joe Wright spoke about in his DVD commentary of the film was this concept of framing shots through windows as mirroring internal perspectives and the lens that we view the world and other people with. And there are so many wonderful shots in this film, filmed behind a character, looking through a window, seeing more characters having dialogue within that room. And it's a metaphor for essentially our own bias, our own pride and prejudice that we view things with, and the impact that has on what we understand as truth. And one final thing I want to say before we get into what Lizzie's wearing is a lot of people say Lizzie would never have worn that, blah, but the reality is in the book we actually don't get a lot of detail on what Lizzie is actually wearing. Yes, there were standards for what women were wearing at that time and what was fashionable and everything, but we don't actually get a lot of detail for what Lizzie actually wore. So that already gives the movie a lot of room to interpret and move, and it's also a really good vehicle for making meaning and reflecting her internal landscape. So let's start with our girl, Lizzie. Jacqueline Duran said she wanted Lizzie to read as tomboyish, clever, bright, uninterested in current fashion, and involved in nature. And we see that immediately when we're introduced to Lizzie as she's walking through the fields, reading her book, and she's just blending into her surroundings. Her book's this beautiful dark brown and her dress is this beautiful dark brown. It's very nature, earthy tones that we're seeing. And fun fact, the book that she's reading, when we see her kind of close it over and slam it shut, is the original version of First Impressions that Jane Austen wrote. So it's a cute little nod to her work in a visual way. So then we see Lizzie and her father interacting for the first time. And it's one of the many times we see them kind of mirroring each other in the way that they wear their clothes, but also their colour palettes. And we know Lizzie is his favourite daughter. And this is kind of like a visual shorthand for their connection as father and daughter. This emerald gown was just so beautiful, but there was a very tiny detail that we see around the neckline that was just a common occurrence across dresses at that period in time. And it was a really clever closure technique. So she has a little very delicate kind of lace trim around the neckline of her dress. And through that lace, she's kind of woven a ribbon around into and out of those holes. So that actually acts like a kind of drawstring closure or tightening closure around the neckline if she wants to keep it kind of more modest. So I just love that little detail on the garment there. And then she's traveling to Netherfield to see Jane in her striped dress and her beloved brown coat, the brown coat that I'm going to talk a lot about. And her hair is down because she was at home and she wasn't expecting to go out. So she didn't even think, I guess, to put it up because she just wanted to get to Jane as quickly as possible. And it's kind of it's unstyled because of neglect, not because of like a specific styling choice that she's trying to project. She's not really thinking about herself. Her main priority is just getting to her sister. And then once she's gotten to Netherfield and she's checked on Jane, we see that she kind of comes down from upstairs and she's taken off her coat. She's somehow put her hair up to look a little bit more respectable, which is a kind of like telling small detail that she is willing to adjust her outside appearance to fit the room in a very kind of minimal way. Now, this brown coat, it is, in my opinion, definitely a man's coat. It is oversized. The shoulders kind of drop off her shoulders. It's well worn. It's a very masculine fit. We've got the double vents at the back for what I would assume would be horse riding. And also, Lizzie is consistently the main character who does not wear gloves in the entire film. And this inaccuracy actually reads as more of a characterization of her refusing to perform for people and staying true to herself and as close as she can to herself as possible, even though by Regency standards that absolutely would never have happened. Now, I love this look. It's like this beautiful white shirt underneath a sandy linen crossover pinafore dress. But again, I feel like it's so masculine coded. It looks like a men's shirt. Both the dress and the shirt have a collar, and even the little gathering on the drop shoulder head is identical to the men's shirts that they were wearing at that point. And Lizzie is also the only sister who never wears a bonnet. Well, she wears a bonnet in one scene in the church, but she probably because she was absolutely forced to, but she never ever wears a bonnet, whereas all the other sisters do. And Duran actually got a lot of criticism about the men's coat, and we do never see Lizzie wearing a police coat or a spencer. I actually made a spencer, which I don't have on me right now, but I'll put in some images and some video of it. The spencers were always kind of like very fitted and detailed and extravagant and had lots of wonderful design details on them. And we never see that on her. We always see her wearing these kind of two coats, one of them very masculine and one of them slightly softer, but still masculine coded. I think her other coat actually has a sash lapel. I think it's called a sash lapel. It's like a tuxedo jacket where it has like no notches in it and it's all kind of one piece. So that's the collar we're seeing on her there, which is a bit softer than her other jacket, but still very masculine coded. So she's got 8 dresses across the film and they're all skewed very kind of muddy, earthy tones. And it's this theory that she's chosen to wear them so when she goes for walks, the mud and the grass stains don't really show up on them. Now, when she visits Netherfield that first time to go and see Jane, and she comes into the room and Caroline and Darcy are sitting there, and Caroline just like says the bitchiest thing where she's like, look at her hem. It was 6 inches deep in mud, positively medieval. So that moment, Caroline is being super bitchy, but it's also the moment that Darcy kind of like starts falling in love with Elizabeth because he's seeing that she is just discarding propriety and her main goal is to see her sister. She has this kind of laser-like focus and devotion to making sure that her sister is okay. And so while Caroline is reading that as her being like poor, Darcy is reading that as she's so committed and devoted to her sister. It reminds me of how I feel about my own sister, Georgiana. So he's connecting with her actually through that moment. And this is kind of a plot seed for later on when Darcy has his own muddy hem, but I'll get into that later. Then we see towards the end of the film where Lizzie actually visits Pemberley for the first time, thinking that Darcy's not going to be there, but she still changes her dress into white. And this is one of the 2 white dresses that she actually wears in the film. The other white dress is obviously at the Netherfield ball when she's dancing with Darcy, but all the other girls are wearing white too. And my idea is that the last time she had seen Darcy when she visits Pemberley was when he gives her the letter telling her about his side of the story with Wickham. And I feel like she changes into white because she is feeling like she needs to choose purity and repentance as a way of making up for misjudging him. And she also kind of visually becomes one of the statues when she's walking through the statue gallery. She's just blending in with him and his home. And I love the back detail of that gown. There's a lot of beautiful contrast stitching that we can see on top of the actual fabric. And we also see that dress actually has a 2-piece sleeve. So dresses for that time, it was quite stylish to have a longer sleeve that had a very narrow wrist. But the problem with that was if you had a 1-piece sleeve, when you actually bent your arm, you wouldn't have much movement. So they made 2-piece sleeves that were cut on the bias and allowed for movement around the elbow, and I guess gave you movement to move your arms around while still having that narrow design silhouette. So I love that they had that 2-piece sleeve in there. And to me, the stripes on her dress, when she was walking through the internal rooms of Pemberley, you can see the kind of Greek columns in the background. And for me, her dress was almost reading as if it was the fluting on the Greek column. So I love that kind of like mirroring of her blending into Darcy's surroundings when he, which we will see, begins to blend into more of her color palette and her surroundings as they fall in love with each other. Now, it's very unlikely that a gentleman's daughter like Lizzie would be wearing earthy and muddy tones, since darker clothing for that period was really associated with workers and labourers and people who actually did dirty their clothes while doing labour. So this tomboy palette of Lizzie's is really a romantic invention, not period accurate provincial dress for her class that she's in. And then we see her wearing a kind of brown corduroy dress opposite Darcy's now open jacket. So their costumes are kind of beginning to converge with each other. And in the final proposal scene, she's basically wearing her nightgown, her chemise, and then her beloved brown linen jacket over the top. So yes, it's unlikely that a gentleman's daughter would be wearing these kind of tones, but it is serving that kind of Cinderella narrative that Wright has chosen to put this story through. However, my theory is that the reason her costumes are very plain and lack adornment, her hair lacks adornment, no jewellery, hardly any ribbons or details or trims or even prints, is that she's not wanting to attract attention. She doesn't necessarily want to get married unless it's absolutely the right person. And I feel like by presenting herself the way she does, with no gloves, no bonnet, no bells and whistles and trims and fancy flowers to make herself out as, I guess, a commodity in a way, something decorative, is that she is staying as true to herself as possible. And so the person who does end up falling in love with her and wanting to be with her is visually seeing the core of who she is in the way that she presents herself. There's no kind of facade. She's being her real honest self. And I love how the costume is a visual shorthand for that value system of hers. Now, for my favorite grumpy, overwhelmed, but secretly soft and squishy on the inside, Mr. Darcy. First, I have to admit, I am obsessed with Matthew Macfadyen as an actor. He is such an incredible actor. I grew up actually watching him in Spooks, which was like a kind of British spy television series. So he's so fantastic. And I love that bit where Mrs. Gardner has seen Darcy at the pub or whatever, and she's like, I don't know, there's something pleasant about his mouth when he speaks. And Lizzie kind of like starts touching her mouth. I'm like, yes, he has such a beautiful voice and a way of speaking that kind of just draws you in. So anyway, that's just a disclaimer. Okay, so Mr. Darcy has a 4-stage costume arc. And I believe that his costume arc in this film is the biggest, most telling visual journey in terms of a costume that we go on. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. So we start when we first see Darcy, which is at the Meryton Assembly Ball. When we first see him, his collar is super high and his cravat is like literally tied up so tight up around his neck, and he's very kind of big and lofty. And he's also wearing a navy and black double-breasted coat. Now, the giant collar to me is acting like literal walls. So he doesn't have to kind of speak to people. He's literally putting his walls up. And then the very big and lofty, voluminous cravat, literally tied up around his neck, super tight, is a kind of visual way of saying that he's not very good at talking, and he doesn't want to talk to people, and he struggles to talk to people, but also he struggles to be honest with himself and other people. So even just in the collar and the cravat, I'm like, yeah, I get it. And also, it's almost like the collar and the cravat and the double breast, like the double crossover, double breasting of the jacket is like he is protecting his vital organs. He's protecting his throat and his vital organs as a way of protecting his vulnerability. So he's just like wearing armor is what's happening here. And this entire look, when you look at what he's wearing in the final proposal scene, it is just like this genuine contrast and the start and the end of his emotional arc in the film and the book. Because it's like at the end, he's like all open, his shirt's open, his neck's, there's nothing around his neck, and he's literally just so vulnerable and exposed, and he's finally being true to himself and being honest with his feelings. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. The next time we see Darcy is at Netherfield when Lizzie walks in with her muddy dress. And already his jacket is beginning to soften. The colour is the same, the cut is the same, but what we're seeing is actually that it's made of a different fabric. And that fabric is also, from what I can tell, is treated. So whether it's kind of been pebble washed when garments are literally chucked in a giant washing machine with pebbles and they're washed to give it a kind of worn effect, or it's been potentially enzyme treated, which is a chemical that softens fabrics. Something's happening where we're beginning to understand that his environment is softening his hard exterior. And Jacqueline Duran actually said that. She said, in the middle stage, he's wearing the same style, but in a softer fabric and in a softer cut. So I just love that already we're seeing his character progression in even just the second scene that we see him in. And then when he's leaving Netherfield, he's actually introduced a colour. He's wearing a kind of chocolate corduroy jacket and a slightly lighter grey suiting underneath. So I feel like already he's beginning to absorb his environment and lighten his colours and actually bring some colour in. So I love that scene. And then at Pemberley, where Lizzie comes to visit, he's actually wearing a print. His jacket is open and he's actually wearing a vest that has a check print on it. And I had to pause it and be like, it's almost like a window pane. And then this is where I started going a little bit woo, is that how we were talking about Wright's interpretation of looking through windows at other people and the glass kind of distorting our understanding of them, but we are still interpreting who they are through that particular lens, through that frame. And my interpretation of Darcy wearing a check vest is that this is the first time he's wearing a print. And in a way, by doing that, he is allowing us to, or allowing Lizzie to actually look internally at him, and he's beginning to be more, I guess, forthcoming with his emotions. And we do see that, like, this is towards the end where he's really starting to open up a lot more and be a lot more honest and also invite people in as opposed to just like walling them out. So my interpretation is that these window pane checks on his vest are an invitation for Lizzie to actually start to see him for who he is. Don't know if that's a bit woo, but that's what I was feeling. Now, right at the end where he kind of brings Bingley back to the Bennett household so he can propose to Jane, he is wearing multiple prints. Okay, so he's wearing a cravat that has a mini kind of sprigged floral on it, and he's wearing a striped vest. So we're print mixing here. He's starting to find, I guess, joy in a way. He's helping reconnect Jane and Bingley. And I feel like the florals and the stripes are the two key prints that we see in this film. And they're kind of communicating different things. But in this sense, the fact that he has a kind of more joyful, naive, floral print on his cravat at his throat is that he's starting to find joy again and find that communicating and supporting his friends the way he's supporting Bingley in that moment is giving him joy. And that's being communicated through the costumes that he's wearing at that point. And this is what Duran said about Darcy. She said, if you look closely, Darcy's costumes in the course of the film change quite radically. In the early scenes, he's wearing a very buttoned up, very rigid, very stiff style of costume. And then by the end of the film, he's wearing a much looser cut, an open jacket, a more country style, less uptight and less rigid. His costumes reflect the other changes in his character. Now let's compare and contrast how the costumes differ in the first iconic proposal scene and then the final proposal scene, because it's really mirroring what's happening to the characters' internal landscapes. So the first proposal is when he's kind of approaching her from around the corner. It's like torrenting down with rain, like it is just torrential. But the really interesting thing with this scene is that there was a lot of perspective and direction choices that mirrored what was happening with Lizzie and Darcy. So we've got the rain physically coming down. And to me, this was about Darcy kind of lowering himself to her slightly lower class standards. And yeah, it was a reflection of the kind of class system and where they were at and what he felt like he was doing. And the rain is kind of eroding him and melting away his ability to kind of hold it all together. And that him letting out his emotions and telling her how he feels is him kind of releasing and discarding what he feels is kind of like a dirty secret, how he's feeling about her, that kind of release. And then I also noticed when you're looking at the framing of Lizzie versus Darcy, when he's talking to her, she has these columns behind her, whereas he has nothing behind him. And to me, that was like she was almost caged and cornered. And we do see that through the direction that Darcy actually approaches her from around the corner. It's quite like predatory in a way. And then the fact that she's kind of cornered with bars behind her. So visually, we're seeing how she's actually feeling and the power imbalance of that interaction. So now the second proposal, the iconic walking through the mist proposal. It's so contrasted to the first proposal because he is actually walking towards her and it's that soft dawn light, the kind of mist is revealing him and he's arriving to her as opposed to descending on her. He's really meeting her in the middle and she's watching him come to her from her perspective. So it's not like she's being cornered or approached from around a corner. She's actually viewing him coming to her. And then when they're actually talking, the framing is a complete mirror to the first proposal. So perhaps now she has all the power in that scene as opposed to before. And now let's talk about his hem, because his hem is what? 6 inches deep in mud. So that's really mirroring what Lizzie was doing for Jane when she first came to Netherfield. Now Darcy's doing it for Lizzie because it's a devotion language that she understands. And he didn't need to. He could have ridden there or gotten his carriage or whatever, but he's choosing the means of transport that communicates devotion to Lizzie. And for me, this proposal scene has absolutely no kind of class or hierarchy in it. This is two people essentially meeting in their sleepwear and in their most kind of vulnerable state. To me, this is basically the Regency version of a sex scene. And costume-wise, when we look at Darcy, his neck and his chest are kind of open and bare. And when we look in contrast from the first time we see him, that is just showing his entire arc of the film and that now he's so ready to be open and honest and communicate with her, but also that he's like offering himself to her, fully knowing that she could completely reject him again. And we see that in the dialogue. And then after the proposal scene, they go back to the Bennett household and they go and talk to Mr. Bennett to get his approval, I guess, for their marriage. And there's one scene where he's finished talking and Lizzie goes in and Darcy's sitting out the back, down in the bottom of the steps. And he's literally sitting there next to a dog who's also sitting there. And it's like he's just being a good boy, a good dog, and he's sitting there and waiting. And I just love that he's sitting next to another sitting dog and there's a bunch of chickens and there's mud everywhere. And we can really see there that his hem literally is 6 inches deep in mud. So that mirroring is just beautiful. And in the very end scene, he is essentially barefoot, shirt literally just chucked on and his pants just like literally slipped on with them undone around his kind of calf muscles. The costume is essentially as naked as he can get. Like that is just like the most vulnerable state he could possibly be in. And he's totally removed that public self version of him and any sort of armor that he has. And in my humble opinion, this is their wedding night. This is when everyone's gone home, they're going outside and sitting on this table that maybe had their wedding cake on it or whatever, and they're having a nice kind of conversation. But my theory is that this is a post-coital scene and this is their version of pillow talk. Just putting that out there. So Darcy's colour palette goes like this. Black and navy at the Meryton Ball, so he's very rigid and very guarded. Then softened linen but still dark at Netherfield, so he's starting to soften. corduroy texture, softness, and lightening of colour when he leaves Netherfield. So he's softening a bit more and adding in textures and colours. Checks and an open jacket at Pemberley. So he's feeling at home. He's more relaxed. He's beginning to adopt print and asking her to see him through that kind of print vehicle of the window pane checks. Then he's wearing the printed cravat with the little sprig florals and the striped vest and the soft blue linen at the Bennett house when he brings Bingley to propose to Jane. So he's beginning to find joy, openness with his friends, and honesty on how he wants to live his life. And then right at the end, he's barefoot, undressed, no class division, at Pemberley with Lizzie. So he's fully himself, completely and totally vulnerable. Now we've spoken about Lizzie's and Darcy's costumes separately, we need to talk about how they actually interact with each other. So over the arc of the film, we see Darcy really move towards Lizzie's colour palette. So the earthen tones, the slightly lighter colours and stripes here and there. She never moves towards his formality or his kind of rigidness. He's softening and moving towards her. So it's like her value system is kind of winning out in terms of who's coming to who. Now Lizzie's brown coat, the brown coat, my theory on this coat is that it is actually her father's coat from when he was younger, and she has stolen it and wants to wear it because two reasons. I think it's about her connection with her father, and it's a really beautiful way of sharing a piece of clothing as a visual shorthand of how they're connected, but also it's a form of protection for her in the sense of projecting this kind of masculine silhouette and disguising herself so she doesn't have to deal with potential suitors. I feel like a lot of the feminine colours and prints and details, bows and flowers, you are presenting yourself in a decorative way, potentially to attract male suitors. So I love that she's doing the complete opposite of that, and she's using her father's, potentially, that's my theory, her father's coat as a form of protection. And then it also kind of mirrors Darcy in the final scene where he's walking towards her in the mist and he's wearing his greatcoat and he's almost like cosplaying as her. I don't know, he's kind of mirroring her. So I love that contrast. And yes, the matching muddy hems. This is like my favorite little Easter egg of the entire film, that everyone goes on about Lizzie's muddy hem and Caroline hates it and blah. But Darcy realizes that this is a devotion language that he understands, because the meaning of it means that you are disregarding any care for clothing, propriety, social standards, because you want to get to that person because you love and care for them. So Lizzie shows that for Jane, and then at the end when Darcy's walking through the field, Darcy is showing that to Lizzie. Now the hand flex scene. This is why Lizzie not wearing gloves in the film is actually really important. Despite it being totally historically inaccurate and never actually would have happened, it is a vehicle to create a dialogue and an understanding that I guess stands out from the film and gives it kind of like that electric sense of the hand flex that happens after it. So Regency women absolutely did wear gloves just for propriety and modesty mainly, but also, dirt and germs and all that kind of stuff. Great. So bare hands were for at home when you were with your family. So the fact that Darcy helped her into the carriage from Netherfield is just wild, because first of all, it wasn't his place. It was Bingley's house and he was a guest. So it's not like he was the host helping her into the carriage like Bingley helped Jane into the carriage. She wasn't wearing any gloves, and then he made full eye contact with her. Like, my theory is that he has seen Lizzie come and be brave and just walk all the way from her house to find Jane. And he wants to show that he can also take a little element of that want to be brave and give it back to Lizzie. So it's like this communication that has zero dialogue that is so beautiful and will forever be like one of my favorite scenes in cinematic history. Okay, the song. When we first meet Georgiana, it's when Lizzie is kind of like sticky beaking around Pemberley and she hears a song and she's kind of attracted to it. So she walks through and tries to find where the sound is coming from. She realizes that it's Georgiana. And do you know why she's drawn to that song? Because that is the song that she played terribly at Rosings when Lady Catherine de Bourgh forced her to play it. And Darcy, it was the first time he really attempted to have a conversation with Lizzie, like a proper conversation. And she just absolutely crushed him. And my theory is that he has gone home told Georgiana all about how much he's desperately in love with Lizzie and that she was playing this song on the pianoforte. And Georgiana learns it as a way of kind of helping her brother, I guess, deal with his infatuation with Lizzie, but also support it. And funnily enough, it is also the first song that we hear when we meet Lizzie for the first time at the beginning of the film. And when you actually look at the original soundtrack done by Dario Marianelli for the film, the song is called Mrs. Darcy. So it's just a really beautiful 3-point connection with a composition that mirrors a kind of character arc in the film. I love that part. Now, water is present in both of the moments where Darcy is kind of like revealing himself, right? So the first proposal scene, it is torrenting down and it is essentially eroding him and his walls and his armor to let his feelings out. But it's done in such a way that it's like very violent and aggressive and not at all what Lizzie needs. And then in the final proposal scene, he is kind of coming out of the mist, right? So when you look at those two scenes together, we're seeing so much character progression. The first proposal scene is very violent, very like from above down onto someone, projecting things. Whereas in the final proposal, he is a lot more gentle and he's revealing himself and kind of cleansing and purifying the feelings and being honest, and the mist is slowly fading away. So I love how water kind of is a character in itself and how it mirrors Darcy's own internal landscape of his feelings. Now, one of the clearest and most distinct uses of comparative costuming is the Bennett sisters. And it needs to happen so we can get a clear understanding of the different personalities of the different sisters. So with Jane, she's the most kind of refined and the most feminine. She's getting, I guess, all of the money and attention because she's the most marriageable at that point, but it still kind of has that homemade provincial feel. So Duran said for Jane, she would be so feminine, she'd be in pink and pale blue. And to me, it kind of gives this reverse Jemima Puddle Duck aesthetic. She's introduced surrounded by ribbons and embroidery, and this is her visual signature from the very first frame. I love that she's wearing the same sleeve design in this scene because it's also the same pink dress sleeve that we see from the first ball, but it's just in a different fabric. So this is telling me that they have a dressmaker or a mantua maker, which is what they were called at the time, who has one pattern and is creating it in a bunch of different fabrics. I love that little continuity detail. Now, ribbons as Jane and Bingley's love language. Bingley visibly appreciating the ribbon on her dress, and she puts on a fresh ribbon the instant she learns that he's back in the neighbourhood. Now, Mary is kind of coded as the blue stocking, which means plain, simple, intellectual coded rather than romantic coded. We see she's consistently in very dark brown, almost black, and sometimes often with an apron, which is distinct from Lizzie's earthy but not black plainness. Then we see Kitty and Lydia. So Duran said, I tried to make it so that they'd sort of be mirror images. If one is wearing a green dress, the other will be wearing a green jacket. So you always have this kind of visual asymmetry between the two. She calls them her Tweedledee and her Tweedledum. So they're introduced in microflorals, which is immediately coding them as young and frivolous. Then they're squabbling over Jane's specific clothes for the ball where they'll meet Bingley, which is a kind of small detail about the status anxiety even within the family because all the sisters are already out. Then they're matching in green at the first ball and matching again at Netherfield, and then matching bonnets in this scene. So they're styled with accurate children's hairstyles despite being practically out in society. But I think it's like a visual shorthand to understand just how young they are in comparison to their sisters, but it also makes the whole Wickham situation with Lydia even more kind of gross because of how young she is. And I love this undergarment detail. We see Jane and Lizzie wearing proper stays that have the kind of cup in it, whereas Kitty and Lydia are wearing these really flat stays that kind of crush their bust, which my theory is that Kitty and Lydia are wearing dated clothing because it is Jane's and Lizzie's clothes from like 10 years ago. So it kind of matches up that they're wearing the undergarments and the overgarments of their sisters from 10 years prior because that's kind of the age gap between them. Now, Mrs. Bennett, she's wearing visibly aged and discoloured dresses. And to me, it looks almost like they're sun faded around the bodice, like it's been worn and washed for years. Now, I loved this scene. I only realised it when I rewatched it and noticed that they were actually dyeing ribbons in the kitchen, and they were dyeing them with beetroot juice. Now, if you've ever dyed with natural dyes, we know that beetroot juices tint things pink, but if you wash it without a mordant, it will go like this kind of yellowy brown. So unless they treat it with a mordant and it stays the pink, but my theory is that potentially they were just tinting it that pink, and they know that when it washes, it will come out and they can dye it a different color. Brenda Blithen, on the level of craft, she said the costumes were entirely handmade by Sands in Rotherhithe, and her, being from an earlier period, even had deliberate repairs and mismatched fabric patches built in for authenticity. So Miss Bennett is dressed in 1780s style, specifically called an Italian gown, robe à l'anglaise, with treble stacked sleeve flounces. So this is a full generation out of date by the film's own 1797 setting, which is period accurate for an older matron. And then Lady Catherine de Bourgh, she is in an even older silhouette. She's in more of a rococo gown, it's called a sack gown, which is closer to a 1760s style, which would make sense because that would have been kind of her heyday. And then the cross-sister print language. So like I said earlier, the two key prints in this film are florals and stripes. And Kitty and Lydia and Mrs. Bennett are wearing the small sprigged florals and spotted prints that make them come across as kind of immature and frivolous, whereas Jane, Lizzie and Mary, the serious trio, are consistently in plain, solid and striped fabrics. Now, on to the fierce fashionista that is Caroline Bingley. As much as we love to hate Caroline Bingley, she really is just a product of her environment. London high society and snobbery. And she perfectly plays the villain that we need in this Cinderella story. Duran said Caroline Bingley was definitely more advanced fashion-wise because she'd come from London. And she's definitely one of those characters who genuinely is on trend. The silhouettes actually are era-specific. And it's almost like that communicates the fact that she utilizes fashion and style and being on trend as kind of a weapon in her skill set for the marriage game. But really it's all for nothing because it just disguises her ugliness and bitchiness underneath. Now her waistline is definitely higher than Lizzie's, like at least 10 to 15 centimeters apart. You can really see in this moment here the difference between the silhouettes that Lizzie's projecting and Caroline's projecting. You can see here Lizzie's very flat chested and compact, whereas Caroline is showing that very trend silhouette, which was called the round bodice. So the stays that had the cups in it and were really showing that kind of rounded pigeon-like chest, and then the column silhouette, whereas Lizzie's chest is very flat and her waistline is 10 to 15 centimeters lower than Caroline's. So already we're getting like a side-by-side comparison of like rich, poor, stylish, provincial. We're getting that contrast set up straight away. So we can kind of then just see the vast difference between them character-wise as well. But this is totally an inaccuracy. So the Bennets wouldn't have dressed like this. Like they would have had access to all the latest fashion plates. And we actually see that at the start of the film when they're going around the house and you see the fashion plate kind of cutouts on the walls. So the girls are fully aware of what's on trend and in fashion at the time. So this is that real kind of anachronism part playing into the Cinderella story here. And then we see Caroline's sleeveless gown at the Netherfield ball. This one is just, I am 100% upfront, this is a complete inaccuracy and anachronism. And I know I said there was no mistakes, but I feel like this is just the real one mistake that they made here. Like, no way in hell would she have worn a sleeveless gown. It actually genuinely just looks like a chemise, but more in a silk kind of taffeta or a satin fabric. So yeah, this one dress was just a flat out anachronism for no particular reason. It wasn't to further the character dialogue in a visual way. It was just like completely wrong. And especially for Caroline, who's supposed to be on trend. Now I loved this shot at Rosings of Darcy, Colonel Fitzwilliam, and then Mr. Collins right at the end. And I saw it somewhere on a blog somewhere. The person was talking about how this was just a direct representation of like upper class, middle class, and lower class. And it's not just the three of them next to each other. It's the fact that Darcy is the tallest. And then Colonel Fitzwilliam is like the second tallest. And then Mr. Collins is like the littlest one, like right down the end. And you can also see the confidence of them through the postures that they're assuming, as well as obviously the different codes of clothes that they're wearing. So I loved this visual and it was a great way of representing three different classes. And then the ribbon dyeing here and the dressmaking, the reusing of sewing patterns in different fabrics are really the film's own evidence against not poor, just resourceful ethic that we're seeing about the Bennets. And this one little moment, I only realized when I was flicking through one of my books by Hilary Davidson. She did Jane Austen's wardrobe. She is a fantastic author. So if you want to look at her books, I actually met her in real life and she signed my book for me. But there is one particular blanket that we see in one of her books that is a quilt that Jane Austen herself with her sister and her mother made together. So they made that from leftover remnant fabrics, kind of stitched together to make a beautiful quilt. So this is that resourceful nature that a lot of people had back then, because you didn't want to just throw out things for no reason. You wanted to make it into something else. And we actually see on Jane and Lizzie's bedspread a quilted coverlet that looks almost identical. It's got a bunch of mismatched print fabrics all kind of sewn together. So I really loved that connection, and I would love to know if they knew that and they made that on purpose because it connected back to Jane Austen. So neoclassical was the trend of the moment because it mirrored what was happening politically in that era. Now, I love this moment of Lizzie looking at the veiled sculpture in the Pemberley kind of statue room. It's right as Lizzie's realizing her own prejudice, and she's viewing this beautiful veiled marble sculpture and how it's blinded in a way with the veil over her face. And I feel like she's looking at it and she's going, oh my God, that was me. And that's why she's so fascinated with it. And this beautiful sculpture is The Wounded Achilles by Filippo Albertini in 1825. And it really is an image of hubris, which we see all through Greek mythology and Greek literature. And it's so appropriate for Darcy's pride, but also Lizzie's own misjudgment. And then the Darcy bust, watching Lizzie from behind as she kind of meanders through the sculpture gallery. I love how this mirrored Darcy from the Netherfield ball, watching Lizzie when she was walking through and just admiring the general splendor of it all. I loved that connection of those two scenes. Caged birds. Now, this is a motif that I kept seeing come up all through the film. And I think we first really grapple with it when they're at Rosings and they're seeing Lady Catherine de Bourgh. And we see once Charlotte knows she's going to see Lady Catherine de Bourgh, she puts a little feather in her hair. And that seems to be her way of, I guess, assimilating to this new life that she has and finding a way to blend in. But the interesting parallel with her putting a bird's feather in her hair and then being at Rosings and seeing all of these kind of caged birds, it's almost trying to tell us that marriage, in the sense of Charlotte and Mr. Collins, is a cage, in the sense that it is protection, but it's also restriction. So I really like this kind of nuanced visual communication of what marriage meant to Charlotte and the way it can be looked at on opposite ends of the scale. I also loved where Lizzie was having this conversation with Lady Catherine de Bourgh over the table, and Lady Catherine was just appalled that all 5 Bennett sisters were out in society at the same time. And she couldn't believe that all 5 of them were out. And at that moment, there's 5 lit candles right next to Lady Catherine's face. And Joe Wright said that was a purposeful creation. So this kind of number of 5 representing the 5 daughters all out in society at the same time. I thought that was a really beautiful visual motif. And then right at the end, in one of the final scenes, we see Pemberley at nighttime and we see 4 swans in the lake. And Joe Wright said that those 4 swans were meant to represent the remaining Bennett sisters, and that the final 5th swan, which was meant to represent Lizzie, she had turned into a human and gone inside Pemberley. So I loved that use of birds again, but the sisters as swans, and that one of them had made her way into the house. Now, stripes as a marker of maturity and seriousness, I really tracked the way that stripes were represented all through the film and what characters kept coming up and in what moments were they wearing stripes. And I found the majority of the time the people who were wearing stripes were more serious characters. And one of the most interesting moments where a character changes to wearing stripes is when Lydia comes back and she's married to Wickham. And for the first time in the entire film, she's actually wearing stripes. So prior to that, she was always wearing kind of naive dots or sprig florals or bright colors. But in this moment, she's wearing more of like a monochrome look, and it's with stripes. So when we talk about and I'm going to get technical on this because I used to be a textile designer. When we talk about naive prints, we talk about prints that are small and almost youthful in the way that they're joyful, right? So you think sprig florals, they're not consistent, they have a lot of detail, they can be kind of all over the place. They're very organic and natural and joyful, youthful, and sometimes considered immature. Whereas stripes are consistent, they're reliable, they're predictable, you know what direction they're going to be going in. They are repetitive, right? So for us as humans, when we visually absorb these two different prints, there are meanings attached to those prints. And I think it's really cool to see how Lydia started wearing stripes at the moment that she thought she was now a mature woman because she was married. So it's not necessarily that she was mature, it's that she wanted to, I guess, disguise herself or play dress up as a mature person and wear a certain print that aligns with that way of thinking or that way of acting in society. So she's wearing stripes. That's my theory. And I loved the little nods to practical domesticity. There were a few moments where Mrs. Bennett was wearing, and actually Lizzie was wearing, jumps. So jumps were a little vest, a quilted vest that women kind of wore at home if they weren't going out. That gave them extra warmth in the colder months. And it's like a little quilted padded vest that they just chuck on over their day dress. And it's basically our version of a hoodie or a cardigan that we wear at home when we're just a little bit chilly. So I loved seeing those insights into what women were wearing around the home when nobody was looking. And we also see Lizzie and Jane both wearing a robe. So this robe was called a banyan robe, and it was a kind of a loose T-shaped kimono style robe that was really fashionable for men, but also women. And these two robes, I realized, were matching. They were just in different colors. So I love that kind of sisterly connection between the garments. They were so beautifully embroidered. I feel like not many people talk about how beautiful they were. And the term banyan refers to a caste of Hindu merchants in India who wore similar flowing robes. And so we're also seeing an insight into what was happening in terms of the empire at that point of view and the influences that were coming into fashion and impacting what women were wearing in terms of embroidery and print, and how that related, to where the empire was at and what they were doing out in the world. Now, here are some really funny, interesting tidbits of like behind the scenes stuff that not a lot of people know about, but I find so fascinating. A lot of people hate on Lizzie's or Keira Knightley's wig in this film, and understandably so. We get all the little fuzzy little bits at the back, and people are like, what the hell is that? But at the time, Keira Knightley was actually filming Domino, so her haircut in real life was super short. So she didn't actually have all these kind of like little flyaway bits to make it look realistic. They were super short or like literally shaved to her head. And though I do think they could have done a better job of her wig, that's a reason why it was potentially not as realistic as we would have wanted. Now, here's like a wild piece of trivia. So when you rewatch Pride and Prejudice, you're going to be like, oh my God, that would have been so awkward to film. Rosamund Pike, who plays Jane, her ex-boyfriend is the actor who played Bingley. Now, they'd broken up however long prior to filming, but when filming started happening, she was actually dating Joe Wright, the director. And as they were casting, her ex-boyfriend auditioned for the role of Bingley. And apparently there was some dialogue where Joe Wright had to talk to Rosamund Pike and say, by the way, we've been auditioning all these different guys for Bingley, and so, your ex-boyfriend is really good and we want him to play Bingley. Is that okay? And apparently Rosamund Pike was like, yeah, that's fine. But when you watch the proposal scene where Bingley is proposing to Jane, I used to be like, that looks so romantic and beautiful. What amazing acting. And now I've been watching it and I'm like, they're like ex-boyfriend and ex-girlfriend, and the girlfriend's new boyfriend is filming his current girlfriend being proposed to by her ex-boyfriend. Oh my God, I just can't even imagine what that was like. I mean, I'm sure they were professional people and just got along with it, but yeah, it just kind of changes that scene for me now. And on top of that, Keira Knightley, who plays Lizzie, was dating Rupert Friend, who plays Mr. Wickham, when this was all happening. So Lizzie and Mr. Wickham, they actually do, in their scenes they have together, have like this like kind of chemistry where I'm like, what is this? And now that I know they were dating when they were filming that, I'm just like, whoa, that's crazy. And on top of that, Matthew McFadden, his wife, Keely Hawes, she's an incredible actress. They actually met when they were filming Spooks. But Keely Hawes at that period in time looked so much like Keira Knightley. They always had the same haircut. It was crazy. And I just wonder whether Matthew McFadden, when he was doing the more romantic scenes, was like imagining his wife opposite him to kind of like go to that place romantically. And Keely Hawes is also in a Austenverse related show called Miss Austen, which I would highly recommend, where she plays Cassandra, Jane Austen's real life sister. Highly recommend that show if you're into obviously all of this kind of period drama Austenverse. There's also a moment where Mr. Bennett's outfit is repeated directly. And I actually love this because it just made it feel more realistic that it was a garment or an outfit that he just wears on a regular basis. But not just that, this particular outfit is a direct mirror of one of Lizzie's other outfits where she wears a white shirt with the kind of sandy linen pinafore over the top. And it's genuinely mirroring her dad. Like they're wearing like matchy-matchy outfits, which I love. We've reached the end. I'm so sad. I could talk about this film underwater. And I know there are so many of you who love this movie. And I think this is a cool way of understanding perhaps why you love it. Doing this research really just brought it home to me why I love it so much. As soon as I put my fashion goggles on and I was able to dissect and connect different outfits and colors and fabrics, it made sense to me. I'm like, this is why the film is so impactful, because despite it being way less than half the amount of time as the BBC period adaptation and anachronistic in a bunch of different ways, it really communicates so much more, not just through the dialogue, yes, obviously, but there are so many other layers of the musical layer, and then you've got the costuming layer, and then you've got the scene framing layer, you've got the weather layer. There's just so many beautiful and intertextual things that have to communicate with each other on all these different levels that just push the story and make it so much richer and digestible and impactful. So anyway, I have to stop. This is a long video and I'm probably boring some of you and have lost some of you. So if you've actually made it all the way to the end, can I just say thank you so much for staying with me and going on this deep dive, because I love this and I hope you love it. And let me know in the comments if you learned anything new or if there's anything that I've missed, any other shows or movies you want me to review and look at in this way. I love doing it. It genuinely makes me so happy. So thank you for watching and I'll see you in my next video.